Okay, we're going to do the full Kiddush. V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם, ביני ובין בני ישראל אות היא לעולם, כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, וביום השביעי שבת וינפש. Whoa. So I'm doing as if we were in a yeshiva. זכור את יום השבת לקדשו, ששת ימים תעבוד, ועשית כל מלאכתך, וביום השביעי שבת לאדוני אלוהיך, לא תעשה כל מלאכה, אתה ובנך וביתך, עבדך ועמתך בהמתך, וגרך אשר בשעריך, כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, את הים ואת כל השבם, וינח ביום השביעי. על כן, ברך אדוני את יום השבת וקדשהו, ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם. Amen. All right, so some introductory comments. Pirkei Avot, the 6th chapter, the 6th mission, it's not in front of you. It's all up here. Don't read yet. The 6th chapter, the 6th Mishnah in that chapter reads as follows: Ha'omer davar b'shem amro mevi geula le'olam. He who quotes in the name of the author brings redemption to the world. Why, I don't know. But I am going to quote in the name of the author and tell you that the author today is my son David Burnett, PhD, who actually wrote 3 essays, publications on Pinchas, okay? 2 of them appeared in peer-reviewed journals. You know those bothersome journals that 3/4 of the page are footnotes. But then he wrote one in a platform which is accessible called Torah.com. Torah.com. There is one every single week, and David Burnett wrote one on Pinchas in Torah.com. So his research informed this essay that I have. I know this is different, that we read a text and we interpret it, but what happened as I was developing this, I created basically an essay. So we're going to be reading my essay in sections, and you're going to stop me whenever you want to ask a question or whether you want to offer a comment. Let me give you another preface. If you take a look at the page, it says, Introduction, what is Midrash? Root Rosh, to interpret or seek out. The rabbinic imagination can expand on a letter or a verse, even to distort its original meaning. So I want to tell you the rabbis, and when I talk about the rabbis, I'm talking about sages from 100 BCE through 800 CE, about 900 years of interpreters, okay? And we loosely call them rabbis. And they had a twofold reaction to Tanakh, to verses of Tanakh. Sometimes they were so enamored of it that they chose to expand on that. That is the process of Midrash. Sometimes, on the other hand, they were disturbed by what they wrote. So how do they deal with that? And there are 13, well, let's say 30. There are 13 methods of interpreting the Torah. The first one, namely instruments for interpreting it. The first one was by Hillel at around the beginning of the era, 100 BCE, 100 CE, and he produced 7 midot, they're called, 7 instruments for interpreting the Torah. But the tradition found that wasn't enough. And so 100 years later, Rabbi Yishmael expanded it to 13. Shlosha asa midot nidreshet haTorah. 13 instruments for interpreting the Torah. But even that wasn't enough. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yosei Haglili, we're not sure how many decades after it, expanded them to 32. However, the last 19 were not usually used for halakha, for sacred law. They were used primarily for agadah, sacred narrative. So we are really left with 13, but for narrative 32. So what that means is the rabbis could make any text in the Torah speak the way they wanted it to. A comment. A friend of mine, when we were writing our rabbinic theses, I wrote it on something boring, the law of theft. He wrote it on something amazing called akarot, uprootings. His entire dissertation was 150 pages of how the rabbis uprooted the Torah, literally uprooted it. Very exciting. So with that in mind, let's read the text. By the way, there's a mistake. It's not Numbers, whatever. It's not Numbers 25, 27, 28. I think that I got a telephone call from my great-grandson, and I'm at the computer, and I messed it up. The truth is, and you can use your pencils if you write on Shabbos like I do, to change that to Numbers 25, 1 through 13. It was such a profound passage that the rabbis literally exploded with their comments. So now I would like, and we're going to do it throughout, I want volunteers to read out loud now the pericope. Let me give you a fancy name. Pericope is a unit of study in the Torah. You can call it an episode, but the correct term is pericope. It's a unit of scripture. So the Parashat Pinchas this week actually isn't the beginning of the narrative of the pericope of Pinchas. It starts before. It starts on 25:1. Would someone read it? Yeah. Oh, I forgot. Thank you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Amen. How many of you know Yiddish? You know what the word for occupation is? Asik. That's your business. Asik is the Yiddish word for your business. So what this bracha does, if you know the Yiddish, It means that Torah should be your business. Should be your business. Although there is a passage, and you know I'm going to be doing this all the time apart from the text we're reading, those of you who study with me, there is another passage in Pirkei Avot that says you should not make the Torah kardom lachpor ba. Don't make it a spade to dig with, which means don't make money from the Torah. Well, you know, what are rabbis going to do? Okay. Do you usually, we'll stick to the English, okay? Would someone begin while Israel was staying at Shittim? Just raise your hand and give me your name. I mean, you know, I know it, but give it anyway, which is fair. Yes? Yeah, give your name.
Edith.
Okay.
While Israel was staying at Shittim, the menfolk profaned themselves by whoring with the Moabite women, who invited the menfolk to the sacrifices for their God. The menfolk partook of them and worshipped that God. Thus Israel attached itself to Baal Peor, and Adonai was incensed with Israel. Adonai said to Moses, "Take all the ringleaders and have them publicly impaled before Adonai, so that Adonai's wrath may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to Israel's officials, "Each of you slay those of his men who attach themselves to Baal Peor." Just then, one of the Israelite notables came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions in the sight of Moses and of the whole Israelite community, who were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly and, taking a spear in his hand, he followed the Israelite notable into the chamber and stabbed both of them, the Israelite notable and the woman, through the belly. Then the plague against the Israelites was checked. Those who died of the plague numbered 24,000.
There's another verse. Adonai spoke to Moses saying.
So mine ends there. I have to go to the next chapter.
You don't have it?
Adonai spoke to Moses saying, "Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. Say therefore, I grant him my pact of friendship. It shall be for him and his descendants after him, a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God, thus making expiation for the Israelites."
Okay. So far. What I want from you here is, you just heard it, look at it. I want your reactions to this narrative. I want your emotional reactions and your intellectual reactions to what we just read. Think about it. Yes. Name.
I think to a modern reader it's very disturbing. I think that we think immediately about the terrorists and the self-justification of various bombers and terrorists who say that God spoke to them or they're following God's instruction, and they kill and maim. So I think in modern times it really has a very disturbing feeling to it.
Okay, that's your personal emotional
Yes.
response to it.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Bill.
One
Hello,
second.
it's on. My
One
first
second here. No, I'm okay.
my first reaction was taking justice into your own hands, not waiting for a court or any other body or person to intercede on behalf of the person, so that Pincus just took it into his own hands and killed the person. That was disturbing to me at first.
Okay. We got a hand in the back. Thank you.
Eileen
Without your
Faraji.
comments, we're just going to be reading my essay, so we need your comments.
Okay, Eileen Faraji. I don't think they took it into their own hands. It says God told Moses to do this, so Moses carried it out. And when in Torah times, because I understand Alfred, but in Torah times, it's almost like, not that it's no big deal, but it's like if you're going to watch a mob movie, you're going to see some violence. You already know it's coming. And this is just kind of the justice of the time. And it's kind of like I just sort of read past that and don't get upset and try to just figure out what is the lesson.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I'm Ed Schwartz. I'm struck by Moses' role in this. He seems to have not exercised the greatest leadership in organizing his plan of discipline, punishment, whatever you want to call it. And perhaps that is what led to Pinchas's actions.
So in other words, Moses didn't do his job, so Pinchas did. Okay. That's your midrash on it. Excellent. All of your comments are. Anyone else? Was there anyone else?
William Sanchez.
Give me your name again.
William Sanchez, Sefardita. I'm with Alfred because I live in a world where I personally, intellectually, not emotionally, intellectually, would not trust any man or woman living on earth today that said God told them to kill someone. In today's world, I would not trust anyone who says that. Now, I do understand that we're talking about a time when it was different, but I never lived then. I'm just talking about what I know about now in the world we live in. So intellectually, it bothers me that people could justify killing others based on the fact that they said they heard it from God. But there probably was a reason for it, But I don't know what the reason was for them to necessarily just believe this one individual. That's all.
Thank you. Next to you.
I'm Carol Hall.
Sorry, your name?
Carol Hall. So as I look at the Torah, well, as we go through it and we look at Moses, we're saying God is speaking through Moses. So I think we have to make a decision. Is God speaking through Moses? When Moses says, God says, I do this, is it Moses that's doing it, or is it some obedience to God? I think we have to decide on that, because then the action that he's taking on behalf of God, is it Moses or is it God? So I think first we have to figure out, are we taking it that Moses is hearing from God? Because the judgment is not really against Moses. Moses is just walking in obedience to God. Perhaps it was a time for capital punishment, a drastic movement. If God is saying, this is what needs to be done, and Moses is following him, then God is perfect. Maybe there's something I don't understand, because if he's perfect, then I know I don't understand everything he does, but I must accept it. So that's my take on it.
Thank you. Yes. You have an additional comment. Yes. Go ahead.
It says, the Lord said to Moses, and so maybe the lesson is that it's that important to the Lord that we don't worship other gods, that it's just trying to imprint upon us, don't do this because I would impale people who do it. And it's kind of a gruesome thing. He didn't just say kill them. It said impale them with a sword in their belly or whatever. So I think the lesson is for that action and that command from God is it is that important. Don't worship other gods.
Okay.
Nancy Kramer. My concern here is that there's no indication, as in the text that I read, that God instructed Pinchas to do this. It is that Pinchas took it upon himself. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that this was not necessarily the right thing to be done. Something needed to be done. But I think that we put in what we think it should be sometimes. We think it should be that he was inspired by God's fury of the desecration of the Mishkan by these two people. But it could just be he was just overcome with, that Pinchas himself was just overcome with anger. And that God's reaction to that was to protect him because he did something that Moses was unable to do. Because Moses had, over the decades, learned to control his anger and did not take those immediate actions for the most part. He has a couple of exceptions there.
Was Moses an angry guy?
Not too often, but upon occasion. Upon
Can anybody
occasion.
name a moment of extreme anger? of
When he
Moses?
hit the rock.
What?
And he hit the rock the second time.
No, that was impatience. I'm talking about anger. What? Okay. Does Moses ever attack an Egyptian?
Yes.
Aha. And what does he do to him?
Kills him.
He kills him. He kills him because he was inflicting pain on the Israelites. So Moses has his share of anger, but in this instance, he seems to contain himself, it seems.
And it's many decades later. Moses was a young man when he killed the Egyptian, and he is now a much more mature, older person.
Yeah, my wife tells me that I'm not as angry as I used to be. So, I mean, that's, there's a double thing here, So, like at 88, I'm not as angry as I was at 68. Yeah.
Well, wisdom replaces anger. But anyway, that aside, I think Moses said here where he says, each of you slay those of his men who attach themselves to Baal Peor, because he didn't want to kill the wrong ones, because he wanted to be precise, and he knew he didn't know exactly which people did it, and maybe going more locally, so instead of the federal government from the White House killing everyone who whatever, they would sign it down to the mayors, so to speak.
Yes, pass it down.
Thanks. In terms of my initial reaction, I tend to agree with Alfred. However, I wonder about context also, who it was. Pinchas was Aaron's grandson.
Yes.
And I am wondering whether that imbued on him some special consideration in terms of the environment in which he grew up, in terms of the fact that God did speak at that time to different people, and whether the conditions that were then laid down by God reflected his background and inheritance.
Very good. And he's rewarded that all his descendants, it's not just the descendants of Aaron,
Right.
it's the descendants of Pinchas who are thereafter receive the blessings of kahuna.
But I also wonder whether, had that been someone else, whether the response would have been the same.
Well, we're going to see, yes.
Thanks.
I think Nancy also wants it.
I think Pinchas saw what would happen if they disobeyed and the history of what is happening. I think perhaps he didn't even think about it. He just knew what was going to come. It's going to be God's judgment. And this is not going to be judgment on one person. It's a judgment on everyone. And I think instinctively, without thinking about it, of what's going to happen, he just reacted and do what was with the consequences. So I just think he acted on instinct out of compassion on what's going to happen to the people in this disobedience.
Very good. Nancy, did you have your hand up? No. You were just brushing your hair. Okay. So I want to make a comment about literature. When someone writes some literature, there are three personalities involved: the writer, the characters, and the reader. In each instance, that being the case, we might ask, what kind of a reader did the author here have in mind? Now look, obviously I don't take a classical, I'm calling it a classical view that the Torah was given on Mount Sinai 1,300, 1,000, 2,000, 3,300 years ago, all right? And, you know, if you believe that, that's fine. It gives you a very, very awesome view of Torah. So for me, I always want to know what the writer wanted me to feel. That's why I started asking you what the writer, and since I believe that that the Torah is an exciting melding of multiple documents. We did this the last time, J, D, E, and P, when God is called Yahweh, Yahweh, that's J, D, Deuteronomy, E, when God is called Elohim, and P, the priestly thing. So I always want to know. And then, what does the author here want us to continue to view the text? And now we go to my essay. All right? Okay. Where it says Pinchas extrajudicial execution of Zimri and Cosby. Those are my words. All right? Would someone read it? Yes. Yeah, read where it says Pinchas.
And I'm Nancy. Pinchas is portrayed as a hero in the Torah and rabbinic sources for killing Zimri and his Midianite lover, Cosby. Yet, the rabbis struggle with the absence of any judicial process or deliberative body which contravenes their own judicial norms, and therefore recast or attempt to minimize his act. The Talmud provides the conditions for capital punishment. All violators of capital offenses can only be convicted based on witnesses who warned him before the act and told him that it was a death penalty offense. Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, says they must specify the type of death penalty. Tosafot Sanhedrin 11, 1-2.
All right, stop here. The Tosefta, I just want you to know what the Tosefta is. We have the Mishnah, which was redacted, assembled in about the year 200. And this was done by Yehuda Hanassi, and he may have had a committee. He was a great autocrat up in Tzipori in Sepphoris. And he chose from the traditions at that time those laws that he wanted the Jewish people to have in perpetuity and left out a bunch of stuff. That stuff can be found intermittent in the Gemara, which is the interpretation and expansion on the Mishnah. All right, so that was the year 200. Somebody around the year 300 took those passages that he left out, okay? That he left out. They're called Braitot, Braita. They're called that when it's inside the Gemara. And he assembled them into a competing set of laws that followed the order of the Mishnah, followed it slavishly. So, in effect, whoever that was, or who that group was, felt that there was more that they wanted to hand down to the Jewish people. I'll give you an example. One of the famous passages in the tractate called Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was the ancient 71 judicial and legislative body. Okay? So you have in the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin the following phrase, which we are familiar with. Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek be'olam haba. Paul, translate that, what I just said. All Israel has a portion in the world to come. Okay. Now, is that beautiful? It's also negative, right? Because what does it say? All Israel. So, the Tosefta to that has its own comment. And it follows right that same order. Chasidei umot ha'olam yesh lahem chelek be'olam haba. Paul, translate what I just said.
The righteous among the nations have a place in the world to come.
Yeah. Yeah, so in effect, this particular editor, compiler, redactor of the Tosefta takes issue with the Mishnah itself, or feels that it should be implemented. Okay. Someone read on. The Talmud provides the conditions. Did you read that already, or we didn't read that?
No, I read down to
All right,
where
read
the
it again.
Tosefta.
All violators.
All violators of capital offenses can only be convicted based on witnesses who warned him before the act and told him that it was a death penalty offense. Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, says they must specify the type of death penalty.
Okay. Yeah, of course. There's it. What does this mean? There were Abba Mitot Betin. There were 4 kinds of death penalties. And the Gemara argues which is harder, which is not so bad, and I'll tell you what they are. pretty awesome. The four are stoning, burning, choking, and beheading. Does this embarrass you? It embarrasses me. But they had that four. Those were the four, and they corresponded in severity to the severity of the sin. However, I'm going to now contend, while their norms, I'm reading, convey their discomfort with capital punishment, yet there are exceptions. I just made a statement that could be debated, that the rabbis of the Talmud were really uncomfortable with the death penalty, to the point where it became almost impossible to impose it. Works, all right, I'm going to talk about how it's judged, but say they were judged guilty. Who were the executioners? The witnesses were the executioners. Talk about an emotional response. There is in Sanhedrin, there is the passage, Ketzad mayamanim et ha'edim. How do you instill awe in the witnesses? Some of it is very beautiful. You say to them that the blood of this man, this woman, unto the 1,000th generation is going to be on your head, right? And then they say something very positive that you're familiar with. Kol ha'ived nefesh achat ma'aleh, I'm trying to quote it, ma'aleh katuv ki'ilu ibed olam maleh. Anybody who destroys a single individual, Scripture accounts it to him as if he has destroyed an entire world. Now, the next passage you all know, Kol hamakayim nefesh achat maleh hakatuv ki'ilu kiyem olam maleh. Anybody who saves a life, it's as if he has saved an entire world. You've heard this. I want you to know there are two versions of it. I gave you the universal version. There are two versions found in the Talmud. One of them says, Kol hamakayim nefesh achat b'Yisrael. Anybody who sustains the life of a Jew, it's as if he has saved the entire world. So even here among the rabbis, you have the universalist and you have the particularist. We still have it in today's world. While their norms convey, more, they, and we're going to deal with this shortly, if we get to it. I made a mistake, I forgot how passionate and articulate you are. We're probably not going to get to the end of my stuff. It's all right. First, you had to assemble a Sanhedrin. That's 71. And there is a text here that'll prove it. And then, if it was an economic issue, a court of 3 was sufficient. If it was a capital case, you needed 23. And here was the process. The first day, they accounted the acquittals and and the condemnations. Those who said he, I'm going to use he, but I mean she too also. So they count he counts the ones who voted for acquittal, and he counts the ones that voted for guilty. The next day, if they had to, because they didn't conclude, anyone who voted the first day for acquittal could not change his mind for guilty. Anyone who voted guilty could change his mind for acquittal. Finally, they vote. If 12 vote for acquittal and 11 vote for guilty, he goes free. Well, that's obvious. No, it's the reverse. If 12 vote, I'm getting a brain block. Even if he was found guilty, you didn't require a majority. Didn't require a majority. And he went free. There is another comment in the Gemara that said if 12 vote guilty, he goes free. 12 vote guilty because there is the suspicion that they colluded. If everybody votes guilty, he goes free. Okay. The imposition of capital punishment is very strange. I had a teacher colleague, his name was Kravitz. He was a rabbi later in life. I mean, he was a very scholarly guy. And he wrote a PhD dissertation on the Masor. The Masor is a Jew who hands over information to the non-Jewish community that could be used against a Jew. He wrote a dissertation, and that he showed that only once in 1,000 years was the death penalty imposed in the Jewish community, and that was only in the case of a Masor, someone who gave information to the non-Jewish community. All right, somebody else reads, whoever steals. While the norms convey their discomfort with capital punishment, yet there are exceptions. Would someone read that, please? Whoever steals.
Ron Feldheim. Whoever steals a cult vessel from the temple, curses God's name by a spell, or has intercourse with an Aramaean foreign woman, zealots may dispatch him. Mishnah, Sanhedrin 9:6. Thus the Mishnah in the rabbi's eyes would justify Pinchas as a righteous zealot.
Okay.
A famous narrative.
Hold on. I got to. All right. Any comments about in the rabbi's eyes would justify Pinchas as a righteous zealot? Look what the exception is. Intercourse with an Aramaean foreign woman. I think that what the rabbis here want to do is protect Jewish continuity. Look, in our day, intermarriage or marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew is more the norm, or is it probably more the norm than otherwise, except in the Orthodox community. Otherwise, anywhere from in excess of 50% of marriages today are between a Jew and a non-Jew. I don't remember the exact details. But what this passage wants to do, remember, it's an author of the Talmud. We are reading it, and he has the content. He wants us to protect the continuity of the Jewish people by marriage only to a Jew. Okay, page 2.
A famous narrative similarly idolizes Pinchas from Maccabees 1:2 from the Apocrypha. As he finished saying these words, a certain Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in Modain, according to the king's Antiochus order. When Mattathias saw him, he was filled with zeal. His heart was moved, and his just fury was aroused. He sprang forward and killed him upon the altar. 25. At the same time, he also killed the messenger of the king who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. 26. Thus he showed his zeal for the law, just as Pinchas, son of Salu, did with Zimri.
Okay, so let me identify this for you. The book of Maccabees, there are 4. But Maccabees 1, from which passage I selected, is probably one of the most famous. Children in religious school read this, although it's, it's pretty bloody. This was written 100 BCE. 100 BCE, after the successful revolt against Antiochus. You know what I'm talking about. And cleansing the temple. That's how you have Hanukkah. It means to dedicate, to educate, to cleanse. So this was written afterwards. Interesting problem. It was originally written in Hebrew, but we only have the Greek. Why is that? Why is it preserved altogether? Because Christian monks who were educated in Hebrew and Aramaic translated into Greek for the Christian community. Because if the Maccabees had not won, there would never have been a Jesus. It would have been the end of Judaism, and therefore Christianity would never have been born. And they recognized it. And in certain editions, Protestant, Catholic editions of the, I'm going to use their term, Old Testament, Maccabees is included in the canon. In our Tanakh, Maccabees is not. It's excluded. But in Catholic, in the Douay version of the Old Testament, Maccabees is included precisely because of what I said. And since the New Testament was written in Greek, it's the only one we have left. Okay. Next, I just put in the Hebrew zeal. So what you have here is Pinchas's narrative echoes down, let's take the traditional attitude that the Pinchas episode, pericope, was 3,400 years ago, all right? 3,400 years ago. And yet, his action echoed down 2,000 years. because Pinchas is viewed as the hero to emulate. Even though we may have ambivalence about him, the writers of the New Testament, the compilers, saw him as a hero. All right, I'm going to read the next. The ambivalence towards Pinchas' violent act appears in additional texts which insisted that he convened a Sanhedrin. Such was required under rabbinic law to administer capital cases. And how do we know that such a court existed in the time of Pinchas and his uncle Moses? Because in Bar Midbar, in Numbers 11:16, it reads, "Gather unto me 70 men of the elders of Israel." And with Moses, there were 71, the size that you need of the ancient Sanhedrin. So, what the rabbis are doing, they are projecting back their own standards. These passages tell us more about the rabbis than it does about the episode. And what is the proof text? And Pinchas arose from the midst of the community. We read that, 25:7. He arose from his Sanhedrin. What was he doing? What does it mean he was rude? He was sitting with another group, and he rose from the midst of the community. He rose from his Sanhedrin. The proof text, that's my comment, while fanciful, is served by midrashic method to assuage rabbinic distress at what otherwise be extrajudicial execution, which they could not tolerate. Reading next page 3. Finally, Midrash Numbers Rabbah. This is a compilation of probably 400 or 500 CE. Finally, Midrash Rabbah offers a parallel observation. From where did he rise? They were debating the matter of whether Zimri was liable for the death penalty or not. This is another attempt to make Pinchas's act judicial and not extrajudicial. So, I'm going to continue reading.
Wait, Rabbi Burnett, right
Yes.
here. I'm right over here. Sherry, turn around. Right here. I have a question. You said in the beginning.
Thank you for stopping me.
Yes, you said in the beginning that when you're doing it, it's the writer, the character, and the reader, and basically what the writer wants the reader to know. The Torah is a living document, and it depends upon, where you are in time. So my question is this: what is it telling me now? What is, as I'm the reader, whether I believe it is J, whatever, or from God, what is it telling me now in my world today is what this means to me? That's the question.
All right, so why don't let's hear some answers to the question.
Oh, I don't have the answer. I'm sorry. I'm Eileen.
All right, can we first of all, it's a question, but it's really a challenge.
Right, no, I understand.
And so I want to leave it as that. So good. There are questions that don't require answers because the questions are that good. So we'll leave it. Yes.
Eileen Paraji. So I say this with all due respect to the rabbis down through the ages, but I do not understand how they missed that it's extrajudicial to have the Lord say to Moses a command and carry it out. That just bothers me through this whole thing about judicial and not. You don't need judicial if God said,
God wants it.
do it. Yeah.
Okay. I want to go on. This distress appears in an early composition by Josephus, who was a general and historian, c. 3700 Galilee and Rome. I want to see how much time we have. Oh, you've got 5 minutes. All right, it's worthwhile. Some of you know your Jewish history. Josephus was a general in Galilee during the uprising in Rome in 67 that was finally, destroyed by 70, okay? However, he was unusual. He was bright in the Gemara, we say, Ezehu Chacham HaRo'et HaNolad. It's also empiric. Who is wise? He who figures out what the end is going to be like. All right? He was such a wise man and figured out no matter how proud and how courageous the Jewish people were, they couldn't win. Not only that, but he had contempt and anger at two groups within the Jewish community. One were the Kanaim, the Zealots, and the Sikari, dagger men who were killing other Jews who wanted to surrender. And he was opposed to this. So I'm going to read it. In antiquity, he was opposed to the Sikari, the dagger men, and the Kanaim. In Antiquities, the second of his two histories, he portrays Pinchas and his exploits. Josephus alters the biblical narratives in which our hero appears. Josephus omits the atonement, the appeasement, and reward that resulted from Phinehas' deeds. This idea that a killing, even of sinners, could pacify God is abhorrent to Josephus. In this, he presages and predates our text of rabbinic ambivalence at Phinehas' execution of Zimri. A comment. And you may know this, there are three narratives about the destruction of the year 70. One famous one, Yochanan ben Zakkai, whose nephew was in the Sikari. He says, we got to stop this, because there won't be any Jews left. So he had his acolytes put him into a coffin and to take the coffin out of Jerusalem. The Romans permitted it. They knew the Jews didn't bury anyone in Jerusalem. At one point, a Roman centaur wanted to stab through it. And he said, would you stab through the most important rabbi in the world? So he didn't. And finally, Yochanan ben Zakkai approaches Vespasian, Hebrew Aspagianos, and he calls him emperor. He calls him an emperor. And he said, I have to kill you for calling me the emperor. There's an emperor. And at that moment, a messenger comes from Rome and says, the Senate has just elected you emperor. Vespasian then turns to Yochanan ben Zakkai and says, what can I give you? He says, give me the town of Yavne and its sages. And that was a second Sinai, because out of Yavne and its sages came the prayer book, basic prayer book, and the canon, what was to be considered holy Tanakh apart from the Jewish people. Tam v'nishlam, and with I conclude our session. You can keep it. That was a Roman form of.
That's what I thought. Maybe that was
Yeah, it was the Roman form of execution of anyone whom they felt would be a traitor to Rome.
And that is the answer to anyone that wants to say the Jews killed Jesus.
Absolutely not.
Because it was done in a way that was not one of our
It was totally, because on top of the cross is written, he says he's king of the Jews.
That's why.
And therefore,
Then why did you kill him in a Roman way?
yeah,
You know?
because he was a threat to Rome. You're welcome. Zygazint, everybody. What?